Matthew 14, verse 15 to 24. Today's reading has two really famous stories, the feeding of the 5,000 and what we'll be walking on water. But I think one of the real strengths of journeying through Scripture together in a reading plan like the Moravians is that we often hear stories like this preached in isolation, but really this miracle, it flows out of the story that we've just read of Jesus' cousin and friend John the Baptist being beheaded. It flows out of a moment of grief and vulnerability for Jesus. There's now a demand being placed upon Jesus here that, humanly speaking, is too much for a person. Jesus wants to be alone, and yet here in that context, God's grace and power and provision are released and made available to him. Now the disciples are trying to send the crowds away. The crowds had followed Jesus en masse to a remote place, and they had stayed there all day, and they had no intention of leaving. When I read it, it just made me think about how in church sometimes my stomach tells me that it's nearly lunchtime during the preach. On a Sunday it starts to rumble, my mind goes elsewhere. But there was something so attractive about Jesus, so compelling about Jesus, that people just wanted to be with him as much as they could, without giving any thought to what they'd even eaten that day. And I wonder if sometimes we forget how compelling and how attractive Jesus is to people. Perhaps we would have more confidence in sharing him with others if we remembered that, if we experienced more of that. And of course, the truth is, this side of the cross, now for us, we have total, unrestricted access to Jesus. We have unbroken presence in our lives. Jesus is not trying to escape from us. It's something that we can never take for granted. Now, most of the sermons that we hear on this passage and that I preach on it are around miraculous provision. And I totally believe that. As we take our eyes off our lack, as we give thanks for the little that we have, as we surrender that little in faith to Jesus, he multiplies it. He provides what we need, more than what we need, so that we can be a blessing to others. But I'm really struck here today about how Jesus invites his disciples into that miracle. How they get to give out the bread and fish, how the multiplication happens in their hands. We've said this before in these studies, but really today I'm thinking about how this is part of Jesus managing his own needs, his own limits, in that place of grief, having lost his friend John the Baptist. But I think it's also speaking of how Jesus models the greatest levels of leadership. He is empowering and equipping his disciples to lead. And to do that, he has to relinquish ego and control. So many of us struggle to lead like Jesus because we just can't let go of the good thing in our hand and entrust it to others. The crowds are fed, and now Jesus is able to get that time on his own on the mountainside in prayer with the Father. He's connecting with the Father. That's what he needed. So he dismisses the crowd, and he clearly instructs his disciples to get on a boat. He says he'll meet them on the other side. Now, this is the second story of a boat and a storm. In the first one, Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is in the boat with the disciples and he speaks to the storm, "Be still." On this occasion, he is not in the boat. And we'll continue the story tomorrow, but I think at the heart of his absence is that he's creating space to raise up his disciples as leaders who will imitate him. I believe this space was for them to step into and to speak to the storm. He had promised that he would meet them on the other side. Now was their opportunity to exercise their faith, to exercise their authority, and to speak to the storm. But more of that tomorrow. We'll see how they got on doing that. Pray you'll have a blessed day.